And it is my distinct pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to this celebration of 20 years of the Institute for Faith and Learning. Let me begin by first offering regards and regrets on behalf of my colleague, Darren Davis, Director of the Institute and Vice President for University Mission. As you can imagine, it would take an incredibly extraordinary circumstance to keep him from such an event. And unfortunately, that is exactly the case that we have. Dr. Davis spent much of the end of last week and this weekend in the hospital, battling an as of yet undiagnosed illness. He is home now and recovering, but upon doctor's orders, Dr. Schwehn's orders, and I have a feeling Brenda Davis's orders, he is going to remain at home through this week. But he wanted me to express his great love and appreciation for all of you, for all who've been a part of the Institute over these 20 years, who've been part of the events we've had or programs. He counts it as his great joy to have given the last 11 or so years of his life to Baylor and to IFL. He looks forward to seeing you again soon. The Institute for Faith and Learning was founded in 1997 under then President Robert Sloan. In the summer of 1997, the Board of Regents approved the proposal for the creation of the Institute, and Mike Beatty was named its founding director. The early days of the Institute were enlivened through the Baylor Horizons Initiative, a significant grant from the Lilly Endowment. This generous grant from Lilly transformed the fabric of Baylor University. Many of the things you know today are a part of that. The resident chaplain program that is prevalent in all our residence halls. Likewise, what we now call Communio, a retreat for faculty, was a part of that grant, was formed out of that grant. Our William Carey Crane Scholars Program for undergraduate students who will fill the academy, and from that, the A.J. Conyers Program for graduate students are both products of that Horizons grant. Even things like the Baylor Medical Ethics Conference that our colleague Bob Krushwitz led and we've now taken over. All those were part of that grant. We're thankful for it. Now, so much of the vision of IFL and its trajectory to this day is the result of the faithful efforts of those who saw the need for an institute like this at Baylor University. I'd like to recognize Mike Beatty, the founding director. Mike, if you'll stand. Doug Henry, who succeeded him as director. Doug, if you'll stand. And also Scott Moore, whose work on the initial proposal was instrumental in approval by the Board of Regents. Scott, if you will stand. Throughout the Institute's history, we have been blessed to receive unwavering support from the administration and Board of Regents. From the Institute's inception, Baylor's presidents have been wholly supportive of our mission and our work. That faithful support has been vital to the success we've had. Likewise, Baylor's provosts have been sources of constant support and encouragement. We're blessed to have two of those with us today. Don Schmeltikoff, who was provost with the founding of the Institute, and David Lyle Jeffrey, who also succeeded him and has been an unwavering friend. If you will both please stand to be recognized. Since 1999, the Institute has hosted conferences that aim at engaging the best of Christian intellectual tradition with the significant questions of the day. From the Pruitt Memorial Symposium to Art and Soul, and for the last 10 years in the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture, IFL's conferences have risen to set the standard for Christian academic conferences across the United States and beyond. This is indeed the most significant academic conference, drawing scholars, practitioners, students, and lay people from across the world to our campus. By way of numbers, just for the Symposium on Faith and Culture, the 11th annual that had just concluded, we have had over 3,700 participants representing over 600 institutions from across the United States and around the world. If we add to those numbers the Pruitt Memorial Symposium, the Baylor Symposium, and Art and Soul, that is over 6,000 who have attended conferences hosted by Baylor University in the Institute for Faith and Learning. We now have over 300 Crane Scholars, those students who are being formed as the next generation of Christian scholars who are now around the country serving in all manner of institutions and capacities. We have additional 100 plus Conyer Scholars, graduate students, who are now also going out and serving around the country. The impact of these programs at institutions cannot be measured. We are thankful for the support of Baylor Horizons, of faithful donors who have supported the Crane Scholars and funded that program. We are thankful for the work we do. This is good and important work. And now, more than ever, we are committed to the need for faithful Christian scholarship and faithful Christian higher education that recognizes that faith must animate the life of the mind and that the search for truth is drawing us ever closer to God. This is the work we're a part of, and this is the work that the Institute serves Baylor as. As we continue our work, as we look forward to the next 20 years, we're excited. Through the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture, the Crane Scholars Program, the Conyer Scholars Program, Communio, a retreat for Baylor educators, we continue the work that has been handed down to us, to continue to serve in the way those who have gone before us have, for the good of Baylor and for the good of God's kingdom. We're also embracing new initiatives. The Baylor Medical Ethics Seminar, the Bailey Family Lecture in Christian Ethics, the Baylor Young Scholars Program, aimed at preparing our own for service to the Academy, faculty workshops on character in the classroom, and the Character Across the Curriculum Initiative. In all these ways, we continue to expand our work and seek to serve Baylor as it pursues its mission of educating men and women for worldwide service to God's kingdom. There's one other group that I feel I want to give thanks to and recognize. That is my colleagues at the Institute for Faith and Learning. Dr. Lori Knitz, Vicki Schultz, Matthew Bixler, Rebecca Hayes. We are thankful for their work and all they do. This is a team effort, and it couldn't happen without it. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Don Schmeltikoff, Provost Emeritus of Baylor University, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you. There is no academic in America more appropriate than Mark Schwehn to be the speaker for the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Institute for Faith and Learning. Mark himself is a man of deep Christian faith, and he is a man highly accomplished in the university. And he knows a lot about how the two should be mutually engaged. Professor Schwehn began his academic pursuits at Valparaiso University, a Lutheran institution located in the heart of Indiana, where he received the Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Philosophy. From there, he went to Stanford University, where he received the Doctor of Philosophy in History and the Humanities, and where his doctoral dissertation won the 1978 Allen Nevins Prize, awarded annually by the Society of American Historians to the most distinguished Ph.D. thesis in the field of American history. After tenure at the University of Chicago, Schwehn returned to his alma mater in 1983, where he served as professor and then dean of Christ College, the Honors College of Valpo, from 1990 to 2003. In 2009, he was named provost of Valparaiso University, from which position he retired in 2014. He still continues to teach in Christ College. But these achievements in higher education are only part of the story today. While still at the University of Chicago, Professor Schwehn began to ponder this question: what is the meaning of the academic vocation? In secular schools, but especially in church-related colleges and universities. This led not only to the publication of one of his important books, Exiles from Eden, Religion and the Academic Vocation in America. It also led to his founding in 1990 of the Lilly Fellows Program in Humanities and the Arts, a national network of colleges and universities with a postdoctoral program that prepares teachers for faith-based institutions of higher education. Based at Valpo, the program was under the direction of Schwehn. The network began with 25 charter members, one of which was Baylor. Now there are about 100. And that's when I and other Baylor people got to know Mark Schwehn. Those of you in this room need to know how significant this development was for Baylor. Up to this point in our history, our identity was basically captured in the phrase, the largest Baptist university in the world. But our affiliation with this network, thanks in part to the invitation from Schwehn to be a member, began to change that identity. We now, for the first time in our history, had new and expanded conversation partners. Boston College, Calvin College, Fordham University, Loyola Marymount University, Roanoke College, University of Notre Dame, Pepperdine University, Wheaton College, and of course Valparaiso. Previous to this, our connections were largely with Baptist schools, if not entirely with Baptist schools. Not to apologize. An example of this wider affiliation occurred in the spring semester of 1992 when we at Baylor hosted a statewide conference on faith and learning with representatives from over 30 religiously affiliated colleges and universities in Texas. And who was one of our featured speakers? This man, Mark Schwehn. And the other was Nicholas Wolderstorff, professor of philosophical theology at Yale. Professor Schwehn has been on our campus many times since that conference. So please join me now with a warm welcome back to Baylor, Professor Schwehn.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Don, for that warm and flattering introduction. I can't say how pleased and honored I am to be here on this occasion. I know that speakers often say such things. I really mean this from the bottom of my heart because, as you heard Don say, my relationship to him and to Michael Beatty and to Doug Henry and to so many others in this room goes back many, many years, certainly to the early 1990s. And ever since then, just Valparaiso alone has benefited enormously from not only the wisdom of those folks, but by some of your outstanding graduates here in Ph.D. programs at Baylor who we now have on our faculty or who have been postdoctoral fellows in the Lilly Fellows program. There are just so many good friends in this audience who I have grown to know and to love during these many years that it's truly stirring for me to be here on this occasion. I always like to start with the major bit of wisdom I've picked up during the prior year regarding issues that pertain to the subject of higher education, especially Christian higher education. And this one comes from my old friend Jim Heft, Father Jim Heft, who is now the executive director of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. And I was out there to give a talk recently, and he and I were pondering one thing and another. And somehow this proverbial chestnut came up of the relationship of scholarship to teaching, which has been expressed and explored and stated in many different ways over the years. And he said, oh, we Catholics have figured that out years ago. Really? Yes, he said, and I can boil it down in a nutshell. Scholarship is to teaching what sin is to confession. If you don't do much in the first area, you'll have little to say in the second. I've not forgotten that, as you see. So then from faith and learning to love and understanding, the recent past and promising future of church-related higher education. At the end of his justifiably celebrated work, A River Runs Through It, the post-Protestant writer Norman Maclean includes the following bit of dialogue between himself and his pastor father as the two of them struggle with their grief and bewilderment in the aftermath of the death of Norman's younger brother, Paul. Quote, "Are you sure you have told me everything you know about his death?" my father asked. I said, "Everything." "It's not much, is it?" "No," I replied, "but you can love completely without complete understanding." "That I have known and preached," my father said. One might argue that the whole of A River Runs Through It is an exploration of the complex relationship between love and understanding, of what it means to be a brother's keeper when one never adequately understands either the brother or what the brother needs. I should like to propose this afternoon that we consider the relationship between love and understanding, which I will use here simply to mean full comprehension of the truth, understanding, as an entering wedge into a broader consideration of what the future of church-related higher education might look like if we were to embark together as Christians of all sorts, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, upon the development of a robust theology of higher education. That quest might proceed by way of a thoroughgoing exploration of relationships among Christian spiritual virtues like charity and intellectual virtues like understanding. In order to clarify and defend this recommendation, I will proceed first to provide a brief account of the history of church-related higher education over the past 30 years or so. This will only be a sketch. I will then move to consider the relationship between a kind of Christian friendship, one kind of Christian love, and understanding, before turning to the relationship between Christian charity, the greatest of the Christian virtues, and understanding. Since it would be impossible for me to offer a properly nuanced and compelling account of either Christian love or intellectual virtue of understanding, and since there are people in this audience who by professional training as philosophers and theologians are much more qualified to do that than I am, I'm going to address the relationship between these two virtues through the presentation, being a historian, of suggestive cases, and then try to tease out from these some starting points for the much larger inquiry I am modestly proposing as a future program of thought and action for the church-related academy. First, then, I offer the following brief historical sketch of church-related higher education over the course of the last generation. The overall landscape of higher education, generally, not just church-related, has changed dramatically during that period because of social, political, and economic forces that everybody in this room understands all too well. Technology in support of distance learning, MOOCs and various profit-making educational enterprises, governmental interventions that require easier and broader access to higher education, a good thing, along with greater accountability, and a bewildering and expensive array of compliance requirements, demographic changes, increasing unwillingness of parents to invest in higher education for their children, the unreasonable and sometimes incomprehensible accreditation standards of the various regional accrediting associations, the insistence by the general public that higher education perform the miracle of providing more services of higher quality at lower costs, and of course, macroeconomic developments like the growing gap between rich and poor, and wage stagnation for the middle class and the working poor. Now, in addition to all of these relentless developments, church-related higher education also felt an additional combination of legal, cultural, and intellectual pressures that are often gathered together under the broad heading of secularization. Though church-related higher education in the United States seems for at least the last 50 years to have been in a perpetual state of crisis, concerns about the secularization of religious schools reached something of a crescendo a quarter of a century ago. Books in the early 1990s, like George Marsden's Soul of the American University and Father James Burchell's apocalyptic Dying of the Light, analyzed historically the many characteristics and causes of the secularization of the academy, the title of yet another book from that period. Now, most of you here today have experienced during your lifetime some of these changes. The increasing hegemony of the R1 schools in forming young scholars into an altogether secular conception of the academic vocation that gives primacy to research over teaching and character formation, the declining numbers of religious within Catholic schools and of denominational membership and support within mainline Protestant ones, wildly fluctuating and grossly uneven state support for private institutions of higher learning, often for the sake of maintaining support for public schools, though support for publics is also waning terribly as well, negligence by board members and by senior administrators in attending to mission in the midst of a focus on sustainability and the bottom line, careless faculty appointment policies, faculty and staff reward systems that are not linked to mission in any clear and direct way. Now, in the midst of all the jeremiads and sometimes sleepy and benign neglect in the face of secularizing tendencies, many church-related colleges and universities undertook, both separately and in cooperation with one another, to reclaim, to renew, and to deepen their identities as colleges and universities of the church. Well-established national organizations, like the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, and several Protestant denominational groups devoted to higher education, focused their energies and resources on initiatives designed to strengthen the mission of their member schools. New organizations like the Lilly Fellows Program in Humanities and the Arts sprang up precisely in order to strengthen the quality and shape the character of church-related higher learning in the United States. As a result of the work of these several associations and others, centers or institutes for faith and learning have proliferated. Faculty recruitment and retention efforts at many places have been critically revised. Faculty and staff orientation programs have been expanded and enhanced. Faculty and staff mentoring programs have been installed on every seriously church-related campus. Board members and senior administrators have been educated about the importance of hiring for mission, planning strategically for mission, budgeting for mission, and shaping the entire curricular and co-curricular life of the campus around a common vision that is grounded in mission. Few schools are any longer operating in isolation or in denominational silos. The several charisms that different schools embody have been collaboratively mobilized to establish a set of best practices that all church-related schools can learn from and emulate. We're probably too close to this period of sometimes feverish activity to be able to assess the results of all of these creative responses to the secularization of the academy. In part, such assessment requires granular study of each and every campus and some kind of common wisdom about whether certain innovations really strengthen the church-related character of certain colleges and universities, or instead provide only cosmetic achievements that conceal less encouraging realities. For example, does the establishment of a Center for Catholic Studies or a Center for Lutheran Studies represent a sign of progress by giving greater intellectual visibility to a particular school's character? Or does it represent a sign of decline by focusing the remaining religious energies in one place at that school instead of dispersing them across the entire institution? Who can say? It all depends upon local culture and local context to some extent. Even so, once we allow for these difficulties, we can still advance some modest claims about the successes of some of the ventures I have thus far mentioned. In a forthcoming book from what other press but Baylor, entitled The Return of Religion in American Higher Education, authors Kathleen Mahoney and John Smaltzbauer argue that in three crucial respects there's been a resurgence of both attention to and the practice of religion on both public and church-related campuses across the United States. First, the study of religion in almost all of the social sciences and humanities disciplines has steadily accelerated over the past 25 years. And in many of the social scientific studies, Christianity in particular is no longer treated as a kind of epiphenomenon, a mere veneer covering over or reflecting deeper and more material causes, but as a genuine spiritual phenomenon with its own causal efficacy. Second, religious life on campus has, by every measure, increased. The increase in part reflects a rise in self-proclaimed spirituality among entering students, in part the burgeoning number of different religious organizations and worship centers on campuses, private and public, and in part a growing dissatisfaction with a purely naturalistic account of human life and destiny. Third and finally, the authors report that church-related higher education has measurably prospered, in some sectors more than others, as the result of some of the initiatives that I have already mentioned. So, the general photograph to summarize of church-related higher educations, taken from about 60,000 feet above the ground, suggests that there are more pockets of genuinely vibrant Christian colleges and universities than there were 25 or 30 years ago. There are, in other words, some signs of genuine encouragement and even more signs of genuine opportunity. Perhaps foremost among such signs is the development I mentioned earlier, the proliferation of centers of faith and learning. Baylor's own center is without doubt preeminent among these, and all of us in church-related higher education owe a great debt of gratitude to Darren Davis and his predecessors, Doug Henry and Mike Beatty, and associates, and to Baylor University generally, for hosting so many feasts of learning on a broad range of culturally and religiously significant topics, featuring the very best Christian thought and practice in this country and beyond. Baylor's Institute for Faith and Learning has long ago moved beyond the relatively restricted scope of topics that pertain directly to the sometimes tense and always complex connections between faith and reason. Elsewhere, however, the old apologetic impulse remains, a kind of defensiveness hearkening back to celebrated trials from Galileo to Scopes, but the need to demonstrate again and again that faith is not inimical to learning and can often be its handmaid has diminished considerably and must now be replaced, as it already has been at Baylor and other places, with new tasks. New occasions teach new duties. Perhaps foremost among those duties is, as I suggested at the outset of these remarks, the development of a robust and systematic Christian theology of higher education. Let me therefore turn to my entering wedge into this enterprise by offering some thoughts about the relationship between two types of Christian love and human understanding. First, then, to Christian friendship. As Paul Waddell has argued in his book on friendship and the moral life, and I just learned over lunch, by the way, that I knew Paul Waddell was a very good friend of Darren Davis. The two of them were colleagues at St. Norbert's. What I did not know is that Paul Waddell has often been down to Baylor in certain faculty workshop contexts and also at some of the programs you all have to initiate new faculty into the ethos of the school. So I realize many of you in the room can put a face to this name, Paul Waddell, who's a wonderful man and a great scholar. So, as Paul Waddell has argued, friendship is the very condition for the rest of the moral and intellectual virtues. Or, to put the matter in a way that directly addresses the matters of love's relationship to understanding, without right relationships, he would argue, places like Baylor would not be universities at all. In the present educational environment that I sketched out earlier, church-related universities have the great opportunity through both thought and practice to show the world that friendship and a full comprehension of truth, love and understanding are mutually dependent, and that the primary purposes of any university worthy of the name, truth-seeking and the cultivation of virtue, cannot live without right relationships. It is also rich, the Christian tradition, in providing education that is integral and that stresses formation as well as information, the development of character as well as mind. Even so, it has not yet fully explored and elaborated in both words and deeds a tight, inextricable, and necessary connection between love and understanding, Christian friendship, and the comprehension of the truth. Here is one way to express both the major problem and the major opportunity. In one of the oldest comments in the Western philosophical tradition on the right relationship between friendship and truth, Aristotle suggested that friendship and truth may from time to time be in tension with one another, and that there may arise irreconcilable conflicts between them. And when such conflicts arise, he argued, we must always choose truth over friendship. Here is the full passage where Aristotle is beginning, at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, to formulate a critique of the view of the good propounded by his teacher and friend, Plato. Quote, "This sort of inquiry is, to be sure, unwelcome to us, because those who introduced the forms were friends of ours. Still, it presumably seems better, and indeed only right, to destroy even what is close to us, if that is the way to preserve truth. We must especially do this as philosophers, for though we love both the truth and our friends, reverence is always due to truth first." Now, we could, I suppose, try to soften the force of these remarks a bit by suggesting that Aristotle means only to suggest that we ought never to abandon our sense of what is true simply because our friend disagrees with our views. But Aristotle speaks here of being willing to, quote, destroy even what is close to us, if we thereby preserve truth. The right ordering of our loves requires that we love truth first, our friends second, or perhaps even third or fourth. And we must be ready to destroy certain friendships entirely if and when our friends and we cannot reach common agreement about certain fundamental matters. Though we might well find disagreement with friends, we ourselves might find disagreement with friends unwelcome from time to time, we should think further about the wisdom of losing friends over what we take to be at a given time the truth of matters. And surely we should find such losses, if they should occur, much more than simply unwelcome. Although the choice of truth over friendship will seem to many in the secular world, and maybe some here as well, and to me sometimes, a noble expression of intellectual integrity, the whole discourse should make us at least a bit uncomfortable, and it's worth wondering about why we are and should be uncomfortable. I think we are rightly uncomfortable not because we would choose friendship over truth, reversing the order of Aristotle's loyalties or loves. I think that we instead harbor a different picture of the relationship between friendship and truth, a picture that we may not be fully aware of, but one that we need to raise to the level of full articulacy. Here is one account of that picture, painted in the words of the 6th century CE, about 1,000 years after Aristotle, by Dorotheos, the abbot of the monastery at Gaza. Quote, "Suppose we were to take a compass and insert the point and draw the outline of a circle. The center point is the same distance from any point on the circumference. Let us suppose that this circle is the world and that God is the center. The straight lines drawn from the circumference are the lives of human beings. To move toward God, then, human beings move from the circumference along the various radii of the circle to the center. So, the closer they are to God, the closer they become to one another. And the closer they are to one another, the closer they become to God. Let us put God in Christ at the center and bear in mind that Christ is the truth, and that all truth of whatever kind, empirical, poetic, theological, moral, forensic, narrative, is God's truth. If this is our picture of the relationship between truth and friendship, the problem that so agitated Aristotle can't arise in the deep sense that he outlined. On the contrary, deepening friendship and moving toward the truth, or to a full comprehension of it, are two ways of describing the same process. Truth on this account is both relational and propositional. Strengthening right relationships and moving toward a comprehension of the truth implicate and enable one another in a profound way. Now, the primary suggestion that I have thus far advanced will seem compelling and even familiar to some, sentimental to others, mystical to a few, and muddled to several. So let me descend for a moment from the abstract formulations to particular cases in the interest of greater clarity and plausibility. I said that for Christians, truth should be as much propositional, relational as propositional, and that the best friendships are grounded in the one who is the truth, who called disciples as their teacher and Lord, and who eventually came to call them friends. Teasing out the implications of this suggestion for life on church-related campuses is then a vitally important part of the endeavor to understand the relationship between love and understanding. Here is some of that teasing out. You might wonder, for example, why many Roman Catholic campuses have been much more successful than several of their Protestant counterparts in fully including Muslim students as constituent members of their communities of inquiry. Protestant campuses, especially evangelical schools like Wheaton College, have special difficulties managing this, in part because for many evangelicals, Christian faith means primarily, if not exclusively, intellectual assent to a series of propositions. These propositions are thought to be the bearers of fundamental and absolute truth, and others who do not subscribe to them can't be admitted fully into the community unless and until they too subscribe to those propositions. The practice that manifests this view of faith and truth on some evangelical campuses is the required subscription by all faculty to so-called faith statements. But if truth is relational as well as propositional, what matters is that friendship with those of different views and different faiths is essential to the quest for truth. And, as we have said, all truth is finally God's truth. One therefore lives on such campuses, like the Catholic ones I've mentioned and some Protestant ones, in a community of friendship with those who differ, sometimes in seemingly irresolvable ways, in the reasonable hope that there will come a day where everyone is fully included in the widening circle of friends and all dwell together fully in the truth. Remember again Doroteo's picture. The closer we come to the truth, the closer we come to one another, and the closer we come to one another, the closer we come to the truth. Now, I should be clear here that I'm not privileging the canopy model, wherein you have no tests at all for faculty appointments, okay, to the more restricted model such at Wheaton. Church-related colleges are located along a broad spectrum with regard to these matters, and I've written elsewhere that part of the genius of church-related higher education is precisely its plurality. Argued that we need a Wheaton college with faith statements. We need a college like Baylor, which takes very seriously the Christian faith of its faculty, and we need schools like many of the Jesuit institutions, and like my own, which appoints faculty from a wide diversity of religious beliefs, always with a substantial majority in the faith, or at least a significant plurality of the faith tradition represented by the school. And we would be terribly impoverished if all of the schools on that spectrum were to conform to one or another of those models. I mean, the reason Calvin College had such a great philosophy department for many years was that all of its faculty members need to be drawn from one particular tributary in the Christian tradition, and those philosophers could take so many assumptions in common that they didn't have to argue and re-argue before they could get underway, that they could go to great depth in any number of them. So that's an example of how it's a tremendous virtue to have a department or a college or a university that really does have a faculty that shares in common certain fundamental assumptions. So what my example here about Muslim students being at home at Catholic colleges, more so than at some Protestants, is meant to do is to simply tease out and show some of the implications about the ways we think about the theology of love and its relationship to understanding in terms of all sorts of academic practices that constitute our communities. That's the point of it, not to advocate, say, Gonzaga over Wheaton or Valparaiso over Calvin. That's not the point of it. Paul Waddell, whose book, Friendship and the Moral Life, I have already mentioned, acknowledges the historical tension within Christianity between agape, or charity, on the one hand, and philia, or friendship. Agape, charity, is non-reciprocal, universal, all-inclusive, and non-preferential. Philia is both, or friendship, preferential and reciprocal. I can't be someone's friend if they're also not. That is to say, it's reciprocal back and forth. I'm their friend, they're my friend. It would be silly to say I'm friends with one of you when you're unaware of it. Waddell acknowledges that in our actual Christian communities today, our friendships in the Aristotelian sense will remain preferential and reciprocal. But he insists, and this is the important point, that the salutary pressures of agape push us, or should push us, in the direction of steadily widening the circle of our friends, so that the trajectory of Christian friendship is inclusive, not exclusive. Its trajectory, not its present character. So here again, we discover a strong theological warrant for the practice of hospitality toward those of many and various beliefs and backgrounds. Waddell discusses another trajectory as well. He argues the movement from Christ as prophet, priest, king, and teacher the one who has listeners, subjects, and disciples, to Christ as friend, represents, especially in the Gospel of John, a movement toward full equality. Now, if the character of right relationships is a kind of friendship, or philia propelled toward full inclusion and equality by the distinctive Christian love agape, there is a perfect alignment between what is most desirable for truth-seeking at a university and what is most essential to the Christian life. I certainly don't need to defend here the proposition that an ideal community of inquiry is constituted by a diverse and steadily enlarged circle of friends who are equal and alike in virtue. I am sure that there are still some skeptics about this line of inquiry. Surely you might well object, even hostile rivals can discover truth together, and they seem to do so not infrequently. True enough, in the sense, and in the same way, that it's true that there is honor among thieves. Even so, we need to admit once again that there are different kinds and levels of truth within any university community, and that their particular connections to right relationships will be differently calibrated. And to complicate matters still further, there were for Aristotle at least three kinds of friendship, based respectively on pleasure, usefulness, and virtue. So a full account of the relationship of Christian friendship to understanding will need to be highly nuanced and contextual. Any such account must be deeply informed both by the university's understanding of itself as an intentional community and by the Christian account of truth as relational under the aspect of philia enlarged by agape. We need also to keep in mind the quality of relationships among students and faculty and staff directly affect the quality of thinking done at the university. One of Wittgenstein's most influential insights was that all thought is public before it becomes private. I first learned as a child to argue with others on the playground and around the dinner table. I later internalized those arguments in the form of private thought, what Plato called the hush dialogue of self with self. Wittgenstein would have called it the hush dialogue of self with other internalized selves. Now, if our personal relationships are characterized by arrogance, spite, envy, and suspicion, our thought will be similarly crippled. The student affairs staff member who shapes students to treat one another more charitably and humbly is contributing directly to those students' capacity first to think well together and then to think well within the confines of their own library carols. Let us turn now from philia enlarged by agape or charity to charity itself, to the relationship between the crown of the Christian virtues and its relationship to understanding. As I said at the outset, I propose to work inductively here from two very different but instructive cases to larger and more abstract reflections. Consider first the case of Frank Laubach, a Congregationalist missionary to the Philippines who lived from 1884 to 1970. Laubach's first 15 years in the mission field were deeply frustrating since few of the Moro people, the Muslim population of the Philippines, had converted to Christianity. Sometime in 1930, as he wrote in a letter home that year, he went up to a mountain near the village where he was living on Mindanao to pray. There, God spoke to him and chastened him for his aversion to the people he had been sent to serve. Quote, "You have failed because you do not really love the people. You feel superior to them because you are white." God told Laubach that if he could forget his American whiteness and act only out of love for the Moro people, they would respond. Laubach decided that loving the Moros meant studying their scriptures, the Quran, engaging in sympathetic dialogue, and discovering ways to help the Moros to lead more flourishing lives. He, in other words, lived out the virtue of charity by abandoning efforts to proselytize and concentrating on what the Christian ethicist Jean Outke offered as a minimalist description of Christian charity, quote, to aid a person or persons in distress, unquote. This initial decision launched Laubach on what became an astonishing vocation. What the Moro people needed most, he concluded, in order for them to flourish, was literacy. So he set about teaching them how to read. He went on from there to become the 20th century's most accomplished promoter of literacy as a way to understand, and beyond understanding, to general human flourishing. He began rendering the Moro tongue in Roman characters and then establishing a vast network of schools to teach people to read it. He then created an organization to promote literacy around the globe and eventually produced language primers in 312 languages. When he died in 1970, he had enabled millions of people to read and understand one another in more than 100 countries. In sum, Laubach loved in order to understand and to enable others to understand as well. Now, Laubach's story, astonishingly enough, was not an isolated episode within the larger history of Protestant missionaries abroad during the 20th century. This makes his example all the more instructive for our own purposes. Laubach represented one small thread in a remarkable narrative tapestry woven by the historian David Hollinger in an important book just out last month from Princeton University Press and entitled Protestants Abroad: How Missionaries Tried to Change the World but Changed America. If Hollinger is right, and I think that he is, mainline Protestant missionaries and their children, more than any other group, more than the mass media, more than American commerce and industry, more than the military, more even than the Foreign Service, mediated the many cultures and religions of the globe to the American people from about 1890 to 1960, especially during the formative period of World War II and its aftermath from around 1940 to 1960. Protestant missionaries and their children, because of their sustained and intimate engagement with peoples around the globe, and because they were disposed to regard such people lovingly as they sought to understand them, became the precursors of the most defensible aspects of what in our own time has been called multiculturalism. Many of them began with narrowly evangelicalistic ambitions, seeking only to convert or proselytize, but then, under the pressures of other aspects of their own formation, many of the mainline Protestant missionaries came to regard those to whom they had been sent as their own teachers, their own allies, their own friends. They opened themselves up fully to the cultural and religious riches these other peoples had to offer, and they in turn brought those riches back to this country, just as the United States had begun to assume its role as the preeminent power on the globe in the aftermath of the Second World War. As Hollinger summarizes it, quote, "During the middle decades of the 20th century, missionary connected individuals and groups broadened the perspectives of the American public in general and influenced the operation of many institutions, including federal agencies, universities, churches, foundations, and political advocacy organizations." Hollinger is himself something of a post-Protestant thinker. He was raised in the Church of the Brethren. And he has long been an outspoken advocate of secularity, especially the secular academy. His deep and sympathetic appreciation of Protestant missionaries and their achievement is all the more compelling for that reason, even though it is to some extent limited. Thus, on the one hand, he repeatedly insists that missionaries were not simply transformed by the peoples that they found, but that they were disposed to receive and to comprehend other cultures in certain ways on the basis of their own earlier formation in their churches at home. He says of Laubach, for example, quote, "There is no doubt that his experience in the field had a deep effect upon him, but he illustrates well the ways in which dispositions brought to the missionary experience could render individuals responsive to the redeeming qualities in foreign cultures. He was prepared to see in Filipinos and Muslims qualities that many others were slower to celebrate. On the other hand, Hollinger does not probe very deeply into the nature of these dispositions, which we would, I think, designate as Christian virtues, especially the virtue of charity. We might be prepared to say something that he would not say, namely, that especially during the period of history he described, Christian love really did, in many positive ways, transform the world. Parenthetically, I should say that lest I leave a wrong impression of the book, Hollinger also acknowledges and attends to some of the less attractive and even deeply troubling aspects of missionary influence around the globe in some locations. Our second case study of love in relation to understanding could not be more different from the one we have just considered. It involves a solitary, sometimes isolated individual, not a mass movement of sorts. It involves the effort to understand plants, not human beings. It emerges within the field of biology, not anthropology, much less missiology. So it invites us to wonder whether the character of the love changes depending upon the character of what it is that one seeks to understand. This is the case of Barbara McClintock, one of the most distinguished cell biologists of the last century, who, on the basis of her determined, sometimes misunderstood work in the field of cytogenetics, became in 1970 the first woman to be awarded the National Medal of Science. 13 years later, in 1983, she received the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, the first woman to win that prize unshared. McClintock spent her entire professional life working on the cytogenetics of corn. Her painstaking research led her to a series of remarkable discoveries, some of which were not understood and not recognized until many years after she had originally sought to present and explain them. One discovery in particular was based simply upon her close and careful observations of changes in the phenotypes within strains of maize, simply the appearance, the way different ears of corn looked. From these observations, she was able to infer that various regulated changes had taken place in the positioning of some of the genetic material within the cells of the plants she was studying. This led her to develop a theory of transposition, of controlled repositioning of genetic elements, sometimes in response to environmental stresses. This theory challenged some of the newer orthodoxies in genetics, views that had virtually constituted the emerging new field of molecular biology in the middle years of the 20th century. As a result, McClintock's theories of the 1950s were not fully comprehended, much less appreciated, until 20 years later in the 1970s, when new technologies allowed scientists to observe at the molecular level the very processes that McClintock had long before hypothesized and supported with considerable empirical evidence. Though a part of the initial resistance to some of McClintock's work arose from what she called the fixed assumptions of a conceptual scheme in some ways incommensurable with her own, another part of that resistance stemmed from an inability to grasp, much less to appreciate, the way in which McClintock thought and observed. She always seemed a bit peculiar to her colleagues, though none of them doubted that she was a rigorous scientific thinker. Even so, as one of her biographers tells us, whereas most of McClintock's fellow students of May's were interested in what some isolated feature of any given plant might reveal about maize generally, she sought, quote, intimate and total knowledge about each and every plant. One of her colleagues remarked that she could write the autobiography of each plant that she worked with. Her respect for the unfathomable workings of the mind was matched by her regard for the complex workings of each and every plant, but she was confident that, with due attentiveness, she could trust the intuitions the one produced upon the other. Though the biography by Evelyn Fox Keller that I've just quoted has been superseded in important ways by later studies. No subsequent study has contested its account of the magnificent blend of love and understanding that characterized McClintock's research. The very title of the biography, A Feeling for the Organism, suggests that the source of McClintock's genius was as much in the affective as in the purely cognitive relationships of the scientist to her subjects. As McClintock began to examine the chromosomes in the nuclei of maize cells in order to understand something that had for a great length of time eluded her, she said, as she reflected on the process of discovery, quote, "I found that the more I work with the chromosomes, the bigger and bigger they got. And when I was really working with them, I wasn't outside. I was down there. I was part of the system. I was right down there with them, and everything got big. I was even able to see the internal parts of the chromosomes. Actually, everything was there. It surprised me because I felt as though I were right down there and these were my friends. As you look at these things, they become part of you, and you forget yourself. The main thing about it is that you forget yourself." Intense attention to particular organisms, self-forgetfulness, a feeling of friendship for, even unity with, the subjects under study. All of these taken together begin to fill out McClintock's own way of understanding the natural world. When she was asked to explain what enabled her to see deeper into the mysteries of genetics than many of her colleagues, she answered that she took the time and had the patience to listen to what each and every individual plant was telling her, that she was, quote, open, unquote, to what the organisms, quote, had to say, unquote. This openness to the other resembles the openness that many of the missionaries had to their host cultures. And like McClintock's love for her subjects, the missionaries' love for those different from themselves opened up possibilities for understanding that would, without that love, have never been realized. For McClintock, organism was a kind of code word not simply for a particular plant or animal, but for a living form, an object as subject. Though these two case studies can only be suggestive at best with regard to the large topic of the relationship of love to understanding, they do suggest, I think, some of the contours that future, more comprehensive and systematic and technical and specialized studies might well follow. For one thing, under the intellectual pressure to consider Christian love in relationship to knowledge or understanding, it will not be helpful to work with a concept of charity or agape that distinguishes it sharply from either eros on the one hand or philia on the other. We have seen how Paul Waddell develops a concept of philia enriched and enlarged by caritas without losing the warmth of friendship. And we have seen in the example of McClintock an effective relationship to the subjects he sought to understand that is more akin perhaps to eros than it is to charity. The kind of sharp and even antagonistic distinction between agape and eros that was developed at great length by the Swedish Lutheran theologian Anders Nygren almost a century ago has shaped much of Protestant thinking about love for many years during the middle of the 20th century and beyond. But as the English Jesuit Father Martin Darcy demonstrated in his great book, The Mind and Heart of Love, written shortly after Nygren's Agape and Eros appeared, self-regarding love and other-regarding loves are finally complementary, or at least they can be, not altogether conflicting. And of course, in our own time, the work of another Jesuit, Bernard Lonergan, might well be considered the best starting point for comprehending the human spirit and the relationship between love and understanding within it and between it and both the natural and the divine. Lonergan's work is much more sympathetic to Darcy than to Nygren's on the matter of love. Now, in order to have any prospect of success, however, the effort to comprehend the relationship between love and understanding must be more than ecumenical. It must be interreligious. When McClintock sought a religious vocabulary for expressing the sense of spiritual kinship she felt for her subject, she turned not to the religion of her distant forebears who had come over on the Mayflower, but to Buddhism. And, as Fox Keller notes, a number of the great physicists who were contemporaries of McClintock, Bohr, Schrödinger, Einstein, and Oppenheimer, turned to Hinduism and Buddhism for the conceptual and spiritual resources that they needed to understand their own understanding. Nor should it surprise us that a thinker like Augustine relied heavily upon the Hebrew scriptures, especially the book of Genesis, for guidance in understanding his own soul and the relationship of understanding and love within it. Few other books represent such a tight and complex relationship between knowledge and intimacy, understanding and loving, than the book of Genesis. In other words, like the Protestant missionaries, we too must increasingly attempt to understand what is vital to our own tradition in conversation with others. After all, both activities, understanding and love, are at one and the same time multicultural in one dimension and universal in another. Some of the most important philosophical work on love's relationship to understanding has been done over the course of the last 50 years by women. So we must consider not only multicultural, but also gendered accounts of these matters to some degree. Martha Nussbaum, for example, has a sure grasp of pagan, Jewish, and Christian traditions, and as a result, her several essays, some of them gathered together in books with pertinent titles like Love's Knowledge, should be essential reading for those who seek to fashion a Christian theology of higher education. Perhaps her best book, her first major book, The Fragility of Goodness, develops an extended and compelling argument that defends the cognitive powers of the emotions. The point here is not to develop a reading list, but to demonstrate that the next phase of inquiry into matters of virtue and knowledge as part of a larger theological project must be collaborative. What we need to know and think about far exceeds any one person's learning, and certainly not any one discipline's learning. And indeed, collaboration has come more and more to be, thankfully, a favored mode of inquiry into the whole range of subject I've mentioned. We may think here of the Wisdom Project at the University of Chicago, or the several interreligious conversations about knowledge and wisdom, some of them recorded in publications under the auspices of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. Finally, we should wonder whether further inquiry within the Christian tradition into matters of love and understanding might need to find a starting point or inspiration other than meditation on the nature of the Trinity. From Augustine to Aquinas through Lonergan at least, and including a lot of other writers as well, a large amount of inquiry into the nature of understanding and its relationship to love has been prompted and guided by an effort to understand the Trinity through analogies to the various parts of the human soul or spirit. For, so the argument has gone, plausibly enough, if we're made in the imago Dei, we should find by looking within ourselves a faint image of the Trinity in, for example, the relationships among being, knowledge, and will, or to take another triad, among love, understanding, and truth. I've modestly proposed by contrast here that we might begin, if we're developing a theology of higher education, that we might begin by attending to various academic practices and habits that have developed over the centuries in order to secure understanding, or to various large-scale movements designed to enable human beings to understand one another more deeply. It seems to me highly likely that what we will need to make sense of these practices and intentions will require sooner or later a spiritual vocabulary to do justice to any of these operations. And it may be that any such vocabulary will have to be, to some degree, syncretistic in order to be functional and compelling. Now, I know the word syncretism is a scare word to some, even to me, so I could have used eclectic. But I mean nothing more by it here than the kind of creative energy that is sometimes unleashed by the confluence of more than one tradition of spirituality. George Saunders, the author of the latest Booker Prize winner, Lincoln in the Bardo, was raised as a Roman Catholic and eventually became a Buddhist. The genius of his book derives in part from his own creative fusion of these two traditions on matters of love, loss, and compassion. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. However, we begin the project I've outlined, it's important to get it underway, even though it is but a small part of a larger enterprise that stretches before us. But it is especially pressing, since the stakes are very high. As Boston College philosopher Patrick Byrne, a student of Lonergan, has put it, quote, "Love without understanding is insipid, mere romanticism. Understanding without love is what characterizes our age, an age of so-called rational control and technological advance, which so often is deeply insensitive. The need for an integration of love and wisdom, expertise and know-how is perhaps the urgent need of our time." This talk began with the question of whether we can love rightly and completely without right and complete understanding. Perhaps we can, as Norman Mailer's father preached. But it's highly doubtful whether we can understand rightly and completely without loving rightly. Nick Woltersdorf put it this way, quote, "Augustine believed that only if one departs from the condition of generic humanity and adopts the highly particular stance which consists of loving God above all else, can one genuinely understand the fundamental structure of reality. Misplaced love and hostility hinder knowledge. Loving the truly lovable enables knowledge. In other words, however much we must and should extend the range of our sources and enlarge collaboratively the scope of our ideas, any true account of the relationship between love and understanding must end, even if it does not begin, with God and with our love of God above all else. Let's get to work.
Thank you. You can speak as loud as I can. You don't need this mic, but
All right, I joke that I have the spiritual gift of going first in buffet lines, so I'll use that gift here too to make other people feel comfortable. Thank you so much, Mark. There are a few things I like thinking about. Sorry, my name is Andrea Turpin. I'm an associate professor in the Baylor History Department. A few things I like thinking about more than this. I wanted to ask you, and this is something I think about a lot, both theologically and in trying to nail down historical movements. The catch of being open to other traditions and being humble as genuine love, seeking understanding, almost the sense that you use the word charism to talk about different Christian institutions, and I loved that. It seems reasonable, even from a Christian perspective, that different religious traditions across the world would have charisms of the part of the truth that they are getting at. Hence, Buddhism is getting at a thing that we may forget in Christianity. But if you are a Christian, you believe you do have some kind of a truth that's different than or not yet discovered by the people with whom we're conversing. So how would you put into stronger words or nail down, and you were hinting at this in the way you concluded, that we have to conclude by loving God above all else, the fullness of truth as we understand God above all else. How would you phrase or try to put into words an openness to learning from people who are very different, acknowledging that we can be wrong in ways that may be uncomfortable, while still also believing that we have an ultimate truth to deliver to other people? What would you talk about with that posture of spirit, that connection of love and understanding with that component? So it's not simply a missionary who goes to a complete cultural relativism, but has a humility with a sense that they too have something to add.
Very nice question. I should have said that when I was listing off all of the connections between the institutions Don mentioned that I've been a part of, and Valparaiso and Baylor, we could have cited Andrea. She just won the prize given by the Lilly Fellows program in Humanities and the Arts that it gives to the best book in the area of church-related higher education, broadly understood, and her book was the winner, just announced at Loyola Marymount University last weekend, or 2 weekends ago. Well, you put your finger on what is one of the more difficult issues to navigate, beginning where you began with the way I ended the talk. I think that statement that I read is probably something that you would find any number of people, Jews, Buddhists, etc., subscribing to. I think they would have, Muslims certainly, no trouble with that kind of formulation, so that certain of the things that would emerge from conversations would be startlingly similar. On the other hand, there's no question but that if you're going to have serious interreligious conversations, you've got to be as alert to and honest about fundamental differences as you do about certain areas of similarity. I think that's the only way that kind of broad conversation can proceed, and it can only proceed also over great lengths of time with kind of meticulous care, such as the whole Society for Scriptural Reading that's unfolding at Virginia, going on between Muslims, Jews, and Christians reading each other's scriptures and commenting on them. My hope would be that if the topic, my sense and my experience in my life has always been that if you draw people together around a common problem that's urgent to them all, such that they need one another's conceptual resources, that's much more likely to lead to something true and interesting than if you start by trying in some broad way across a huge territory to come to some kind of common agreement. I mean, the whole Lilly Fellows program works well because no one said, hey, let's be ecumenical. People all said, you know, we're in our different silos as evangelicals and mainline Protestants and Roman Catholics, perplexed by this secularization of the academy and how we manage it, both theologically and, more importantly, practically, and how we manage our institutions, and we need to learn from each other. And basically, people got together, worshiping in one another's tradition without hesitation. The sponsoring campus always has a worship service in their tradition, which is in some ways more important than the conversation, but represents for many low church Protestants, when they walk into the magnificent cathedral at Loyola Marymount, or the magnificent church up on the hill there, the liberal arts college, the Jesuit Holy Cross, just as when those Roman Catholics march in to some of the places and hear that music and hear that way of worshiping, they too are at one and the same time stirred and dismayed. I mean, it's disorienting, but it's also, in the company of the other Christians, quite uplifting. That's the affective and liturgical dimension. But the conversation's the same way. People don't foreground areas where they have to have some kind of collision of absolute truth. They foreground certain kind of common difficulties, such as understanding the relationship between love and understanding, and comparing charity as it works out in the Christian tradition to whatever might be most similar to it in others and how those relate, in order to try to get clearer. And I mean, it's a trait to say that deep knowledge of another tradition often gives you a deeper and clearer appreciation of your own, but I think that often happens and everybody kind of welcomes it, even as though the net gain for everybody is to have had a clearer and richer understanding of some common problem that they simply could not have worked out within their own tradition. I mean, it's kind of like this long and elaborate, that answer, it sounds like the long and elaborate answer that Alistair McIntyre, the prolix Alistair McIntyre, gives in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, on how to negotiate among different competing and seemingly incommensurable traditions. And part of that involves getting inside of the other traditions around some kind of common problem and seeing where it is they fall short and where it is they succeed and so forth and so on. My point would be that if you start with something that deeply matters to communities of learning, as it should, if they're church-related communities of understanding, such as the problematic I outlined and sketched. And you say, we're going to need help in carving out some kind of deeper understanding of this matter, which is vital to us, from Jewish scholars, Muslim scholars, etc., and listen to one another along that. I just don't think that those larger issues that you're talking about would arise. I mean, they would rarely arise. They haven't arisen in the Lilly Fellows program, even though people have some fairly fundamental differences among them on some of the issues that the whole thing explores. I myself, personally, this is not a philosophical move, it's an autobiographical one, have been chastened by the through the glass darkly. There are truths that I think hold ever and always, and I think Jesus is Lord and God is truth. What the nature of that truth is, how well I glimpse it, how well I can glimpse it, is very chastening. I think it's at best through a glass darkly, and it's with that kind of comprehension about those things that I hold dear that I'm able to approach others who I think are in similar predicaments regarding their own traditions, and that's about the best I can do.
Professor Schwehn, I'd like to ask a question as well. I'm Todd Burris. I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department here. But before I do, I'd like to thank you both for your speech today, your talk today, and your long-standing relationship with the IFL and Baylor. I'm in many ways a beneficiary of the influence you've exercised here. Before the Crane Scholars Program was really formalized, I was one of the first beneficiaries of the mentoring that took place in that context when I was a student here. And since I've returned to be a professor here, I've been a contributor to the Crane Scholars Program for most of my years. So I very much appreciate what you've contributed and the way in which your relationship with the IFL has impacted my life indirectly. So thank you very much for all that. And I want to ask a slightly probing question, not to indicate any opposition to the sort of thesis you were developing, but to invite you to elaborate a little further. The question came to my mind as you addressed the second of your examples. When you introduced the first of your examples, you noted the way in which love and understanding can come apart in a certain way, as when people who are fierce competitors and not friends at all can nonetheless work productively to advance the understanding. And that got me thinking with respect to the second example about the way in which they can come apart again, and I would like to see what you would say to massage that. One can study, as the professor you noted did, an object that she loves, and that love can propel her pursuit of understanding and in all the ways you identified. But also the understanding is capable of addressing and tackling and mastering subjects that are altogether unlovely and that one has no affection for positively at all. I myself, just to have an example on the table, I imagine historians can come up with several of them with no further reflection. But I have no love for the philosophy of Nietzsche, nor the man Nietzsche, nor any of its influence whatsoever. But nonetheless, as a philosopher, can take on the task of understanding it. So I'm curious how you would massage the way in which love and understanding come apart in that context. Oh, thank you.
Very nice question. Very nice question. What you said in the first part, to kind of frame your question, and I'll get to the direct question about Nietzsche in a minute, reminded me that you talked about, we know people who study and use words like mastery or control, or I forget what your words were. One thing I had meant to say that will start, I think, to get into your second part and to Nietzsche. And I would have developed it had I whirled enough in time. Another way of approaching this whole problem is to talk about what Paul Griffiths talks about as disciplining intellectual appetite. And he makes a distinction that he gets from Augustine, and that Laney Scales, in a recent article in a book just out from Baylor called Stewards of the Academy, develops. And that's the distinction between curiositas, which wants to isolate and master, and studiositas, which is much more akin to, and indeed is incomprehensible without some understanding of love, as being involved in that disciplined appetite. So that sets the ground then. I mean, that's another dimension of the way it's coming from this, which I cut out on the airplane. But the point is, when one wants to talk about your studies of Nietzsche and anybody else who might be in one way or another reprehensible in terms of their teaching, even that, it seems to me, can be approached in a kind of sense of curiositas, which has to do with mastery, separating something out, protecting it as your own, claiming it as your own territory, and studiositas, which has to do with an altogether different intellectual appetite, disciplined in part through this discipline of love. So it's not as though we would expect you to fall in love with Nietzsche, heaven forbid, or his teachings, okay? We might expect you to love all kinds of people, even if you don't like their teachings. But the point is, that's not where I want to put this. I want to put this back in terms of the character of the intellectual appetite, to borrow Augustine's vocabulary as refined by Griffith and restated by Scales, and say that that's where I would come at trying to answer that very difficult and very important question.
Mark, thank you very much. Illuminating and challenging talk in lots of ways. I'm Doug Henry. I think Jason introduced me at the beginning. So here's a question for which I'm not sure what the answer is, but invite your own reflection. I think at the end of things, I probably come out where you do in the relative ordering of these two goods, love and knowledge, and the related activities. But the tradition does not speak univocally on this ordering. There's a line toward the end of St. Anselm's Proslogion in which he, speaking of the saints in their beatitude, says that they shall indeed rejoice as much as they love, and they shall love as much as they know. So that it seems, on at least an initial reading of that, the capacity of the saints to delight in their loving adoration of God is dependent on a prior knowledge. And there are ways, I think, in which maybe in our experience of these two things together, that's kind of the order we think of. It's why we perhaps think it's silly when someone talks of falling in love at first sight. How can you love what you don't really know, after all? Or if you love what you have fallen in love with at first sight, it's got to be a very shallow, very superficial sort of love. So St. Anselm seems to get the order a little bit different. You didn't, at least unless I missed it, give, I think, the humorous line from McClintock. And I wonder if she doesn't herself give expression to that same Anselmian ordering. She quips about her corn plants, and it's a little unusual to imagine someone falling in love with corn, but with some suspension of disbelief there. She quips of her corn plants, "I know them intimately, and I find it a great pleasure to know them." Now again, there are complex issues of what exactly she means, and we could try to unpack and interpret it. But again, a kind of first blush interpretation here would see her as professing her love. I've come to know these things, and it is predicated upon that upon that knowledge that I hence am able to love them. So I guess I just want to press you a little bit on the point and see if there is a way you can accommodate here an alternative way of thinking about the relation of knowledge and love in the tradition. Or perhaps, and maybe this is to press in my own intuition here, perhaps there's at the root of things a false dichotomy in thinking that one of these comes in a kind of crass foundational way before the other. Perhaps they're covariants in some sense that deeply depends upon an as yet undetermined or unnamed third thing.
I'm not sure whether that was a question or a kind of a lecture there. I think basically you're right. I mean, the last thing that you suggested, that we shouldn't get tangled in whether or not we love in order to understand or understand in order to love, okay? That escaping from that is to say that this is part of a process in which neither one of them precedes the other. Now, I think the relationship is complicated in this way, though. I mean, I began the talk endorsing what McLean said to his father, which is that we can love completely without complete understanding. Now, that counters what Patrick Byrne later says, which that love without understanding is insipid, that is sheer romanticism. What McLean was talking about, though, was that he couldn't fully understand. It's not as though he was just smitten, as you say, kind of a love at first sight. That did not describe his relationship to his brother. But I think certainly with respect to McClintock, and I think in general, the formulation is going to be that to say that we love in order to understand or that we understand in order to love, either put so sharply either direction, is probably not going to, in the long run, as you suggested yourself, hold up. This mixture of joy and love and knowledge, which Anselm ascribes to the beatified saints, right? That isn't surprising because, in a way, when you're in that state, I mean, it's always a problem for thinkers like, well, less Augustine than others in the tradition, to some degree, Anselm. If you think of love as a longing, and the longing happens because of a lack, because of a need, one longs for something that one does not have, and one oftentimes gives the name for that desire love. Well, what happens when you're in the full presence of that you long for? If the need then disappears, do you then cease to love? If love is the name for that desire for what is not fully present. And the answer that many of the medievals gave, and that I think is true, is the love disappears because it turns to joy. Okay? So when it's finally there, when you're finally at the end of the Paradiso in the presence of God, God's self, and you turn away from all other things, what you feel is a profound joy, because that's the final transformation of love, when love is in full possession of its object, which it's longed for all along. So it's not surprising Anselm would have joy along with love, along with knowledge. So you want to elaborate a little more? I mean, are you satisfied with that? Go ahead.
Well, very good, Mark. I guess then the thing that we have to think of in the academy is what that implies for pedagogy, for conversations more generally. There are all sorts of things that we as teachers are tasked with. And, now might not be the time when your mind wants to, or we have the patience to think about pedagogies here that are dependent upon this theology of higher education that we're developing. But that would be, it seems to me, a very fruitful next line of conversation for us to have as a community. If these things are, as we have here described, what does that mean for the cultivation of friendships within the classroom? What does that mean for the nurturing of certain sorts of affections in our students? If we attend to those things, how also do we do justice to the knowledge, to the sheer things that we want our students to know? Or is to ask those questions yet again, somehow to insist on holding apart things that at the end of everything we want to hold in tension or in presence or in fruitful interplay with one another. So,
well, I think you're absolutely right. Pedagogically, we have to find ways that awaken and stir the affections as much as the intellect, and in our pedagogy, understand how those things, one without the other, is not going to lead to a lifelong love of learning. So it's like, which English teacher do you remember more fondly? The one that taught you to love to read, or the one that taught you to read well? And ideally, you'd want the one that taught you to read well to be the same one as the one who taught you to love to read, because the second thing was true, he or she was able to do the first. And that's what I think marks out what we should aspire to be as teachers, and should be disappointed if we don't manage somehow to do both of those things, to love history as well as understand it, to love wisdom as well as understand what wisdom is. And obviously there are many things, if one takes practical wisdom seriously, that we can't possibly know simply through comprehending them in an abstract way unless they're connected to action and affection at the same time, rightly ordered affections.